Father, I pray for the dads in the congregation who attempted to the best of their ability to be fathers, who had one job, some had two jobs to provide for their family. I pray that they would be blessed today, that you would celebrate within them their sacrifices and their love for their family, their children, their grandchildren. I pray that I'll speak the truth and that all of our hearts would be soft. In Jesus' name, amen. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8. And though you have not seen him, you love him. And though you do not see him now, but believe in him, you greatly rejoice with a joy inexpressible, full of glory, obtaining as the outcome of your faith the salvation of your souls. Peter says in verse 8, and though you have not seen Jesus, you love Jesus, and though you do not see Jesus now, you believe in him, which has sent us into the Gospel of John, where we're exploring 7 miracles that Jesus performed. 7 miracles that I'm hoping gives you a better picture of who Jesus is. And the miracle we're going to look at today is the miracle of Jesus walking on water. It's the only event I know in human history where a human being was able to overcome natural laws and was able to walk on water, demonstrating to his disciples his deity, his ability to usurp natural law. If you have reflections, I want you to pull it out. And the reason I want to have you pull it out is I'm going to take a chance this morning. I didn't do it last night, but I want to read 3 different passages because this miracle finds itself not only in John's Gospel, John chapter 6, but is also in Matthew 14 and Mark 6. And they all reveal a different thing. So I'm going to read this to you, but as I read it, I'm going to have you circle certain words because those are the very words that I'm going to refer to in this sermon. So rather than you going from John and then going to Matthew and then going to Mark and then going back to John, I'm going to have you circle the words that we're just going to explore together in this study. John chapter 6, 16. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into the boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark. Circle that. Become dark. And Jesus had not yet come to them. Circle that phrase. Not yet come to them. And the sea began to stir up because of a strong wind was blowing. Circle, strong wind was blowing. Then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him. Circle that phrase. Willing to receive him into the boat. And immediately the boat, circle that phrase, was at land to which they were going. Now let's look at the second passage in Matthew chapter 14. Same event. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. Circle, he made. First line. While he sent away the crowds. And after he had sent away the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Circle, himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone, but the boat was already a long distance from land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Circle, battered by the winds. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Circle, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. And Peter said to him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you, circle, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And Peter got out of the boat, circle, out of the boat, and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But seeing the wind, circle, but seeing the wind, he became frightened and began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him. Circle, stretched out his hand and took hold of him. And said, you of little faith, why do you doubt? And when they got in the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshiped him. Circle that. Worshiped him, saying, you are certainly God's son. Go to Mark chapter 6, verse 45, the third column. Again, another reference to the same event. Immediately Jesus made his disciples to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethesda, while he himself was sending the crowd away. And after bidding them farewell, he left them for the mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea. Circle that. Middle of the sea. And he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, circle, seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. And it was the fourth watch of night. He came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately Jesus spoke with them and said, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. And they got into the boat with him, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight, circle, not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Circle, their hearts were hardened. Here's the story. So it's a beautiful story that has these beats. Jesus, now you got to catch this because there's incredible meaning in all of this. Jesus had just performed the miracle of feeding 15,000 people to their satisfaction and still had 12 buckets left over. And he did all that from 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And because of that miracle, the crowd turned and wanted to make Jesus the king and create a political kingdom. But Jesus wasn't about politics, he was about the kingdom. And he sends his disciples across Galilee and goes up to the mountain to pray. And while praying there, he witnesses that over the next 9 hours, the disciples found themselves having gone to Bethsaida. Instead of making a 2-hour trip, it turned out to be a 9-hour trip because it's the fourth watch, somewhere between 3 and 6 in the morning. And they're struggling in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. They're making no progress. And seeing their struggle, he walks to them. They think it's a ghost. He says, take courage, don't be afraid, it's I. And in the midst of that, Peter says, Jesus, if it's you, call me out. And not only does Jesus walk on the water, but Peter walks on the water because of his obedience to Jesus. But because in the storm, a wave comes up, the wind blows, Peter takes his eyes off Jesus and looking at the wind, looking at the waves, begins to sink. And in his sinking, he screams out, Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reaches out, grabs his hand, and pulls him back. And the two of them get in the boat. The 12 disciples worship Jesus. And immediately that boat that was in the middle of the sea now finds itself on the shoreline. That's the story. What we're going to do this morning is look at 3 questions regarding this storm. Because to me, it's more of a story of a storm than it is about Jesus walking on the water. And here are the questions I want to answer quickly this morning for you. Question number 1, what does it feel like when you're in the storm? When I'm in the storm? When we're in the storm? when the waves are pounding, the wind is blowing, we're not making any progress, we feel all alone, what does it feel like? Because we're going to find it here in the passage. Question number 2, a big question, an important question. What is Jesus doing when we're in our storms? Where is he? What is he doing? And the third question is, what are we to do with Jesus in the storm? Now, let me tell you about a storm I had last night going home after church. The storm was this: 9:30, driving up Jacksonville Road, on my way home. Now, you got to put this in context. I'm going to subtext this so only the adults understand. It's Saturday night. Friday was my wedding anniversary, 38 years, good thing. Today was Father's Day. Add that up, anniversary, Saturday night, Father's Day. I'm racing home. Get it? On the way up Jacksonville, all of a sudden there's a thump, 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 and my first instinct is, oh no, something's wrong with the engine. I keep going. Eventually the noise gets louder. I pull over. It's now 9:30 at night. Just a moment before I was making sure my hair looked good. Now I'm opening the door. I find on my right rear tire is flat. I got a flat. It's dark out, and all of a sudden now I have to fix the flat. Get all the stuff out of the trunk, get the tire out of the trunk, get the pieces out of the trunk, and begin to take the lug nuts off, thinking, why, God, why tonight? Get off 5 of the lug nuts and discover that there's one lug nut that has one of those special tools. I'm on the side of the road, it's now 10 o'clock, and I can't find the special tool that'll get that last lug nut out. Cars are passing me at 45 miles an hour, and eventually I find it. I get the tire off. I got to climb underneath to figure out how this thing works. I get the tire back on. I screw it together. Now I'm sweating. I've laid on the ground. My clothes are dirty. It's 10:30 at night, and I still got another half-hour drive home. That was my storm. That ended arriving at home with all the lights out, which wasn't a very good ending to my story. But in that little quick moment, I'm thinking on the side of the road for an hour, God, this is a small storm. Where are you? What's going on here? Why tonight? Why me? Why did this have to happen? So here's what I want you to see in this event, this storm. Here are 3 things that I think you'll feel in the storm. You may feel in the storm. Number 1 is this: you're in the storm when you can't see your way. Mark 6:17 says it was dark when they found themselves in the storm. Most storms cloud out light. Most storms cover the moon. Most storms in our lives make life get dark on us. We can't figure it out. We don't know where the solution is. We look for opportunities, and it's dark, and we're confused, and we don't know what to do in the dark. And that's where these guys are. They're in the dark, in the storm. Number 2, when I'm in a storm in my life, spiritual storm, physical storm, whatever that storm may be, I often feel I'm on my own. John 6:17 says Jesus had not yet joined them. You ever get that feeling? You ever get that feeling you're rowing and you're trying to solve the marriage or the grandkids or the kids or the job or the house or the finances or the employees or the employers, and God isn't around? You know that feeling when you look and you say, where are you, Father? Where are you, Jesus? It's that feeling. That's what these guys are. They're on their own in the middle of a lake doing everything they can to row, and God isn't with them. I sat with a very dear friend that attends this church, and we have coffee together. And we were sitting outside the coffee shop this week, and I said to him this phrase. I said, where is Jesus right now in your story? And he looked at me and he said, Jesus in my story? Well, what I'm learning, and he started to tell me what he was learning, and I said, I don't want to know what you're learning. I didn't ask you what you're learning. I asked you where Jesus was in your story. Where is he with you right now? My friend looked at me, thought about it. We're sitting outside of a coffee shop. He looks across the street. There's a building at the corner further down on a balcony, and he says, I think Jesus is up there watching me. He's down the street, across the street, on a corner, on a balcony, up there watching me. And I said, and so tell me why he isn't here. Why isn't he here? Right here. Why is he way down the street on a balcony looking down on you rather than being with you? And he said, you tell me. And being the good teacher, I said, no, you tell me. So he said, I don't know. I said, that's fair. I said, if your son came to you and asked you or told you that Jesus seemed a long way down the street on a balcony just watching, what would you say to your son? He thought about it. He said, I would tell my son that he needs to go to the scriptures, find a verse, write it on a piece of paper, put it in his pocket, and throughout the day, pull out that piece of paper and read that verse. And I said to him, that's a better answer than I could have given you. So, here's what I want you to do. Before you get to work today, I want you to write a verse down on a piece of paper, put it in your pocket, and refer to it throughout the day the same way you would want your son to do the very same thing. I need you to do that. Because here's the dilemma for most of us. Most of us, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, live with Jesus way down the block, simply watching us rather than being with us. And for the most part, in our storms, whatever storm that is, we feel alone. Here's the third characteristic I feel when I'm in a storm. I feel like I'm up against the forces against me. I feel like I'm struggling. John 6:18 says the wind blew against them. Mark 6:48 says they were struggling. In the Greek, the word is, this is a gigantic storm. This is a meta or a mega storm. It's like a mega church. This thing is gigantic. This isn't a small storm. This is a big storm. Let me show you a video of Peter and the disciples and what it might have felt like to be in this storm.
Why did he walk away just when we're getting strong?
Surely a Messiah wouldn't leave us like this. A Messiah should be a warrior, a conqueror like David.
Judas, force is not the way.
So tell me what the way of Messiah is.
He's different.
But Mary, what if he's not the one? We're risking our lives. For what?
He has shown us his power. We must have faith in him.
Come on.
He'll not fail us.
He said he'd meet us on the other side. Let's go!
Sail
down! What are you doing?
Don't be afraid. Come. Peter, you of little faith, why did you doubt? You need to be strong.
So this wasn't a little storm with little waves. This was a tiring storm. These guys who thought they were going on a 2-hour journey found themselves not moving along the shoreline, but in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in a storm that Jesus had told them to go into. Why do I say that? Because there are some storms that we experience in our lives that are a result of us being in the center of God's will. There's some storms we experience because we disobey God. These guys obeyed Jesus because Jesus told them to go, and in the midst of their going, they encountered a storm because he wanted to teach them something. And I would suspect, no, the truth is I know, that every single one of us this morning is in some kind of storm. Every one of us. No matter how pretty we look and how neat we look and how confident we look, every one of us is in some kind of crisis. It may be small at this moment, it may be gigantic, but most of us have felt the experience of trying to solve the crisis, the storm in our lives, and make no progress, to make no headway. It's the struggle to get out of debt. And no matter how hard you work, you're still in debt. For some of you, it's the struggle to find a mate. And no matter how much you try, you're still alone. For some of you, it's to find a place to live in a market that makes it difficult to rent, and you can't find a place and you're running out of days before you're to leave the place that you're in. For some of you, it's the desire for a child that you haven't had, or a child that's gone wayward that you have, and you're struggling. These guys were struggling in the midst of the storm. So let's look at the second question I said I wanted to answer this morning. What is Jesus doing while we're in this storm? It's a good question to ask. Here's what he's doing. Mark 14:23 says Jesus went up to the mountain to pray for them. Jesus is praying for you in your storm. You say, how do you know that, Bill? Romans 8:34 says this. Listen. Jesus Christ, who died and then was raised back to life, is now at the right side of God intercessing for us. You know what Jesus is doing right now in the midst of your storm? He's praying for you. He's going to the Father, and on your behalf, he's praying for you. And in this discovery this week, there's some assurance, some hope that in the midst of my struggle, my storm, that Jesus, my Lord, is going to my dad, and he is on my behalf requesting and asking for me. Jesus knows the storm that you're going in. In fact, he knows the storm before you go there. How do I know that? Because Jesus knew that Peter was going to deny him 3 times before Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Jesus knows what's going to occur before it occurs. And yet Jesus says in Luke 22:32 to Peter, I have prayed for you that you will not lose faith. Help your brothers be strong when you come back to me. This is even before Peter denied Jesus. So here's a great truth. Jesus is praying for you. He's not praying for us. He's praying for you. Truth number 2 in the storm of what Jesus is doing is that he is watching our struggle. Mark 6:48 says, Jesus saw the disciples straining at the oars. Jesus was witnessing them. Here's the big truth. The big truth is that this trip that should have taken 2 hours now takes 9 hours. A trip that should have been along the coastline goes into the middle of the sea, and the schedule is blown. They are frustrated. They're doing everything they can to get out of it, and they can't. And here's what they didn't know. They didn't know that Jesus was watching them. He had his eye on them. You know why I know that? Because I know that there are times in my life I don't think Jesus is watching me in my struggle, in my pain. Because not only is sometimes in my life Jesus not at the end of the block, he's on the other side of the world. And what the gospel wants you to know in this story is that Jesus is witnessing, and he is a part of your story, and he sees your tears, and he sees your pain, and he sees your struggle, and he is not in denial, and he's not ambivalent. He is in your story. It's a great truth. It doesn't mean the storm goes away. Doesn't mean you don't struggle in the middle of the sea. Doesn't mean the storm dissipates, but to know that he is in my story changes what I say, because then I can't say things like this: God, you don't know what I'm going through right now. And I often say that. I say things like, God, you don't love me right now. Because if you loved me right now, I wouldn't be going through this, and you would have answered my prayer not today, but a year ago, 10 years ago. It stops us from saying, I got to do this all by myself. It's just me in this. No God. God's good on Sunday morning, but God isn't a part of my life on Tuesday evening or Friday night. It stops me from saying God is withholding good things from me. It stops me from saying God doesn't have my best interest in mind. It stops me from saying I have to do it on my own. Things that I find easy to say. Here's the great truth. God is in your story. I'm going to tell you how much he's in your story and in your storm. God knows when you have bad breath. True. He knows that. God knows when you don't get enough sleep and you're exhausted because you got 2 jobs and you're up all night because you have insomnia or you're fearful during the night. God knows that. God knows when you have an upset stomach. God knows the anxiousness in you when you get that 10:30 phone call in the night and you don't know who's calling and what happens, and after you get it, you're shaking because of the story you've just been told, the event that just happened. And I tell you this, he is sitting with you on the side of that bed when you hang that phone up. Because Jesus says that God knows the number of hairs on your head. He is intimately involved in your life. He is there, and he cares, and he's involved, and he knows. Job tells us that God knows how many steps you took so far today and can give us the number of steps that you took yesterday. And I would suspect there's not one person in this room who knows that, but God knows that part of your story. And somehow for me, there's assurance there. There's assurance that even in my storm, though it's not going to go away, that he is in my story. Number 3, what is Jesus doing? In my storm story, Jesus will act at the right time and surprise me. Jesus won't come a minute early, and he doesn't come a minute late. Mark 6:48, he went out to them and walked on the water. John 14:18 says this, Jesus speaking, I will not abandon you or leave you as orphans in the world or in the storm. I will come to you. And so Jesus comes into our story, and he comes telling us, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. You know what command is written more in the scriptures than any other command? It's that one. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because God knows that the one thing that unites us is that we all have that sense of fear. We live in fear. We live in the fear of loneliness. We live in the fear of failure. We live in the fear of being defective. We live in the fear of being weak. We live in the fear of being vulnerable. We live in the fear of death. We fear intimacy. We fear commitment. We fear a difficult conversation that we have to have, that we're afraid to have it. We fear that the world that our kids are growing up in is not going to be as good a world as we grew up in. We fear that we're not a good dad or a good mom. We fear if we can make the payments. We fear that we may have cancer. We fear, and we fear. And Jesus says to us, don't be afraid. Because Jesus said, I am. He is the great I am. Not that I want to be, not that I might be, not that I will someday be, but I am. I am the sufficiency for you and your needs. Third question we have to ask is this: what are we to do with Jesus in our storm? And we all have them. Number one thing we need to do is found in John 6:31. For it says that they were willing to receive him. Catch that. John 1:12 says, to many as receive him, to them become the power to become the sons of God. The first thing we have to do in the midst of our story and our storm is to receive him, to invite Jesus into our lives if we never have, and if we have, to invite him from the balcony to our side, to practice his presence, to receive him in the boat. Number two, we need to make sure it's Jesus. Peter asked a good question in Matthew 14:28. Lord, if it's you, why do I say that? Because there's a lot of bad teaching out there. And I would encourage you that if you're going to take any major risks for God, you better make sure that it's sound and it's biblical and it works. And you better say, Jesus, is this you? Is this teaching your teaching, Jesus? Is what I've heard something I ought to do? Is this law that's been placed on me? Is this obligation? Is this guilt? Is this shame? Is this you, or is it something else? Is it religion? Third thing we got to do in the storm, we have to obey him. Matthew 14:28, Peter says this, command me to come to you on the water. Here's the big question. Follow this. There's 12 guys in the boat. Jesus is outside of the boat. And Peter says to Jesus, Jesus, if you command me to get out, I know I'm safe. But if it isn't your command, that I'm not safe. Why do I say that? Because I know a lot of people who get into trouble because they fall in love with an idea and then they ask God to bless it. They get it out of order. I get it out of order. I know women who have married men that were the wrong men, and then after marrying the wrong man, they attributed the wrong decision to God. I know people that took the wrong job and they attributed it to God. I know people who make a lot of decisions, and all the bad ones they attribute to God, and all the good ones they attribute to themselves. And I would say to you, it is an important thing before you get married, before you take a job, before you buy a house, before you go in debt, that you hear God's voice. and have the courage to obey him. Here's the big question this morning for us in this story. I think most of us play it safe, and we stay in the boat. This is the boat. Taking faith and getting out of the boat and following Jesus and obeying him, no matter what the consequences of that obedience is, takes us to a level of faithfulness and maturity that you can never find in the boat. Peter learned some things walking on the water that he would have never learned in the boat. And I would say to you, there are some things that God wants to teach you in the storm and faithfulness in the storm outside of this building that you will never learn in the safety of the boat. But look what happened to Peter. Peter walks on the water and then becomes distracted by the circumstance. The wind's blowing, and his distractedness, he made the mistake. Fourth thing we got to do is keep focus on Jesus, to keep our eyes on Jesus. Because the moment Matthew says that he looked around at the circumstances, the big waves, the strong wind, he took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. And I will tell you this in my life, when I take my eyes off Jesus, I always sink, especially when I'm outside the boat. Circumstances have a way of clouding us. Somebody has said that circumstances are like mattresses. When you're on top of them, you rest easy, and when you're under them, you suffocate. There's truth in that. Some of us live our entire lives under our circumstances. How you doing? Well, not bad. Under the circumstances is our response. And Jesus wants us to live above our circumstances. The beauty of the story is that Jesus is walking on the very problem that the disciples have. And what is over their head is under his feet. It's an incredible image. And I say, if it's true here, it's true in your life. And if it isn't true in your life, it isn't true here. That is, the very circumstances that are overtaking you are the very circumstances that Jesus can walk on top of. But how do I keep my eyes on a person I can't see? I can't see Jesus. 1 Peter 1:8 tells me I don't see him, but I love him. I obey him, but I don't see him. How do I do that? What does it mean in Hebrews? It says, focus your eyes on him, the author and the perfecter of your faith. Here's how you do it. You do it by Scripture, by getting to know him, by studying Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And in studying him, you become a better person, and you begin to discover what he's doing. You study that. How do I obey Jesus? Here, I've gone to cities. And in cities, I have spoken. And outside of hotels, I have been propositioned by prostitutes. And I have been faithful to my wife because I practice her presence at that moment when that beautiful woman says to me, you want to spend the evening together? Because I practice her presence. How do you obey Jesus? You practice his presence. You visualize him with you and walking with you. And so Peter in this moment gets his eyes off Jesus, begins to sink, and then Jesus reaches out and grabs his hand and pulls him back. Let me end with this before we take communion. Henry Nouwen is a great author who was in Europe and was amazed by circuses, and in particular, he was amazed by people that did the trapeze. He was always amazed by the flyer, the person who flew and was caught. That's the terms in a circus, the flyer and the catcher. And Henry Nouwen sat down with these trapeze artists and he said, what is the secret? What is the secret of flying? And the trapeze people said the secret of flying is to relax, to stretch out, to reach out, to be still, because that's all the flyer can do. Because if the flyer in the midst of flying begins to grope and try to grab, he will destroy the event, because the whole event rests not in the flyer, but in the catcher. Because it's the catcher's responsibility when the person is in air, floating, arms extended, not grabbing, not reaching, just still. It is the catcher who grabs the flyer and is the heart of the success. Same thing is true for us. When you take steps of faith and you put your eyes on Jesus, all you can do is look at him. And as you're flying through the air, trust that he will grab you and hold you and take you to safety. So what's the secret, bottom line, to living in the storm? The secret is keeping your eyes on Jesus. Here's the truth. It's safer to be out of the boat with Jesus than to be in the boat without him. So in the midst of your storm, in the midst of your difficulty, do you have a Savior that you are committed to keeping your eyes on him, not just Sunday morning, but Monday afternoon, Tuesday night, Wednesday evening, Thursday lunch, Friday at midnight? I want to end before communion with a video that I think emotionally grabs the importance of keeping our eyes on Jesus. Let's watch it.
Ain't it just like a tear to go and blur out everything? Ain't it just like glass to fall and break so easily? Ain't it just like love to leave a mark on the skin and underneath? Yeah, when the pain goes and shadows everything. Keep your eyes on me. Keep your eyes on me. When it hurts too much to see, keep your eyes on me. Ain't it the sinner who gets all the grace sometimes? Ain't it the saint who picks up the pieces left behind? Yeah, and it's human to hurt the one you hurt, the one you love the most, and you can't find the sun. Keep your eyes on me. When you're lost in the dark, keep your eyes on me. When the light in your heart is too burned out to see, keep your eyes on me. Swear you're all alone sometimes, keep your eyes on me. And you can't find your way home sometimes, keep your eyes on me. Keep your eyes on me. Keep your eyes on me. Keep
here's my encouragement to you. In whatever storm you're in, know that you have a Savior who can walk on the water and he can calm the seas and wants to be present with you. And if we can keep our eyes on him, everything looks different.